minutes. Mr. Vidal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to join your committee today, and I thank my colleagues for allowing me to be here. I also want to thank the witnesses. It's great to have you here and great to hear your testimony and input into this very important matter. I heard much from each of you about the importance of relationships. A number of the witnesses, or a couple of you at least, talked about service rather than force and some of that kind of language, and I appreciate that. As the former mayor of a small city in Saskatchewan, we had a very unique policing situation in that we shared a detachment with not only our little city, but the surrounding rural municipality and 2 First Nation communities that we shared our police service with. There was a very obvious correlation between the relationship or the rapport that our community partners had with our commanding officer and how that affected the overall relationship of the service. One of the highlights that we had in our little community and our community's relationship with the RCMP was one time we asked them in their annual performance planning cycle to place a priority on promoting relationship and promoting the good things they do. And we found that to be very effective, both for the community partners, both of the city, the rural municipality, and the First Nations communities, as well as the RCMP, as it turned into a positive exercise in building relationships. So I guess my question for each of you, I'd like to give you all an opportunity to speak to this if you could. Would you offer or could you discuss any kind of best practices or any of experiences that you've had in your past relationship with the RCMP that could be a lesson for all of us across the country to use in improving that relationship and that spirit of service rather than force?
Are you directing that to Chief TG first, or to
Chief TG and President Obed? I would like that opportunity to have all of them to answer that if we could.
Okay, and I just remind witnesses if they direct their remarks through the chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that question, Mr. Vidal. I think, for myself, the experiences, the example that you gave for a small community is a perfect example of how the RCMP need to relate to really the governance. And, for my First Nations community, I'm from Tackle Lake First Nations, and we have 3 police officers up in our territory, and there is, for the most part, a good relationship with our chief and council and our community, including adopting some of those police officers into our potlatch system and adopting them into the Caribou clan, some of them. But and the other example I have is in the Prince George area, where we've created a good relationship with the high-level superintendents, and it really began with Brenda Butterworth's Carr, who was a First Nations woman of First Nations descent, and she'd worked in Ottawa for a while, and now she works for the provincial government in policing. Mm-hmm. But the superintendents now I still have a good relationship with. But, even though on a very high level we have good relationships with many political higher level people, it doesn't translate to those that are on the beat, those police officers. There is still high level of incarceration death rates in Prince George, going back to Clayton Wiley, 2017, Wet'suwet'en Mandale Culver, and more recently my cousin, Everett Riley Patrick, in April. So we could have as great a relationship on the very highest level, but if it isn't translating down to the police officers, it's not going to create the change that we need. And more often than not, we're seeing death in large municipalities like Winnipeg. We have, many other reports, like the Frank Paul inquiry in Vancouver, and the Oka crisis in that municipality. The use of force by many of those police officers, and then militarized, brought in the Oka crisis 30 years ago. So as you can tell, we can have great relationships on a high level, but if it doesn't translate and those relationships aren't translated down to that level, then we're going to have a really tough time. Thank you.
You have roughly a minute left.
President Obed, possibly?
Thank you. just in my personal work experience, I was involved when I was an employee of Nunavut Tungavik to work on the creation of the Nunavut suicide prevention strategy. And at that time, the commander of the V Division, Steve McBarnick, sat in and participated and also had the RCMP as a partner in the creation of the Nunavut suicide prevention strategy. And so it was one of the few times that I've had positive experiences with the RCMP as an institution. And it was remarkable to me how different that relationship was in relation to most other interactions. I also want to just highlight the reports of the Anishinaabe Asti Police Force and the stark contrast of their record serving First Nations people in Ontario, in their own community, from the results and the stats that we have here today.
Thank you very much, Mr.